We're going to talk today about dominion, which I know we've spent many sessions now on the idea of barrenness and the femininity, right? The fruit-bearing idea, the fruit-bearing aspect of what it means to be human. And I've had lots of conversations over the months, like individual conversations, and so I know for a fact that the way that this is getting processed, which is the way I think it's supposed to be processed, is like there's sort of been kind of an awe at, there's a discomfort with realizing, oh, this is me, right? Like this is who God sees me to be. I'm the equivalent of this barren woman, or I'm the equivalent of this laboring woman maybe, or just the weakness, the pain, the suffering, the endurance, all of this. And yet there's also been, I think, a liberation. I've heard people talking about like, you know, the joy of realizing like, it's okay. God loves me this way. God sees me this way. So I had so much fun preparing for today because it's like now we get to talk about dominion, right? It's the top of the circle. Yay, we get to talk about dominion. And I mean, I'm telling you guys, like the stuff that God has revealed in his word for us in this is, you're probably not even going to believe it. It's just too good. And I think that's why when John asked me this morning, like I was kind of getting my stuff ready and just about to leave, and he said, "Are you excited?" And I was like, no, right at this minute. I mean, I was yesterday when I talked to you on the phone. How are you doing? I'm so excited. But getting closer and closer to what I have to share with you today, I have just had this, I know that it's warfare. It's like this feeling of unworthiness of all that God has shown me, in that I want to show you today. There's just this unworthiness that you're gonna meet with. So, you know, the hard thing about femininity is it's like, well, yeah, we know we're broken. Thanks for reminding us, right? And there's that. But the hard thing about dominion, that I know if you've ever been put in charge of someone, and especially if it's in like a spiritual capacity, and now the weight of having a child or being a pastor or getting married, like all of those are stepping into spiritual leadership. And when you're given that task, it's like, yay. And then no sooner are you given that responsibility than you just are like, what in the world am I doing? How, you know, when I carried Esther home from the hospital and she was in her car seat and we like walked in from the car, coming to the hospital, here she is in the car seat. I remember putting her on the kitchen table in the car seat. Her tiny little head was that big, and she's just this little like nugget in this car seat. And I stepped back and I said to John, what were they thinking? They just let us walk out with her. Like they didn't check our credentials. There was no training. What is God thinking? Putting us in charge of this, right? And so there's that feeling of unworthiness that comes when you realize what it is that God's given you. So that was what was behind my praying for this, because you know, I'm fully convinced that what I have to share with you today is straight from God's word. But I also know how our hearts are going to receive it. And so it's fun. It's easy to come into it thinking like, you know, just like, we're just shooting out of the gates. Like, yeah, let's do dominion. This will be fun. But you're going to have to come at it with faith. Just like you have to come at the femininity with faith as well. Okay? And I think maybe another reason why I might be feeling a little intimidated now that I'm standing here is that, I'm just being totally transparent with you guys here, is that, right, it's easy for me to talk as a woman about this side of things because that's what I embody. I have lots of examples like to draw from there, right? But this is embodied in men. And so I've speculated, I've listened to lots of men. I grew up with all brothers. Like I've listened to lots of men talk, and I take to heart what men say about the embodiment of this. And I see what I see. I see the difficulties that men have to carry this, just like the difficulties that women have in carrying this. But I just want to say, like, there's just a sense of unworthiness, I guess, today. So, and I'm going to let God use that as my way of, I'm going to offer that to him and just say, yeah, I am unworthy of this. And that's why it's so amazing, right? That's why you're so good. So he's gonna pour out his love on us today, and hopefully I can do a good job. So, key passage for today is Psalm 8, which is on page 3. So let me just read this, and I think you're going to hear that David, who wrote this psalm, feels a little unworthy too. O Lord, our Lord, how majestic is your name in all the earth. You have set your glory above the heavens. Out of the mouths of babies and infants, you have established strength because of your foes, to still the enemy and the avenger. When I look at your heavens, the work of your fingers, the moon and the stars, which you have set in place, what is man that you are mindful of him, and the Son of Man that you care for him? Yet you have made him a little lower than the heavenly beings and crowned him with glory and honor. You have given him dominion over the works of your hands. You have put all things under his feet, all sheep and oxen, and also the beasts of the field, the birds of the heavens and the fish of the seas, whatever passes along the paths of the seas. O Lord, our Lord, how majestic is your name in all the earth. Let me just point out a couple of things here. We'll get to our notes in just a second, but just a couple of things to set your mind here today. Look at verse 2. Out of the mouth of babies and infants, you have established strength because of your foes, to still the enemy and the avenger. So today's message needs to point us back to Genesis 3, just anytime we talk about the gospel, we're pointing back to the beginning, right? And what God has given us in our dominion is yes, we're unworthy. We're babies and infants. It's like that's how worthy we are to carry this load. But God has given it to the weak, the humble, the barren, the lowly, to still the enemy and the avenger. And remember, Satan came in the garden, and he offers us a dominion of strength. But everything that we've done leading up to this session, I've been trying to get your paradigm shifted to an idea of what God sees in you is your weakness. What he's attracted to in you is your weakness and your dependence and your need for him. So God is giving us dominion, but our weakness, like the babies and infants, our weakness and our lowliness and our unworthiness is part of that plan, is part of what's shaming the devil. Okay, so that's one thing I want you to notice in here. We'll get to more, but I wanted to point that out as we start so that I just feel like this whole idea of unworthiness is just really on my mind today. So, okay, so our hearts are set. Let's dive in. Okay, so now I'm on page 4. We've been in Romans 8 throughout this study. I think Romans 8 is the best chapter in the Bible. I think it contains like the seeds of just about every other theme in the Bible. So let me just hone in on 2 verses that we talked extensively about last time when we were talking about barren women and sons of God and that whole story of God promising the offspring, and then the offspring, that we're keeping our eye on the offspring as the story unveils, and then when we get to Jesus, he's the promised offspring. That's kind of what we covered last time. And in Romans 8, we find out that we're actually part of that story, and that we are, as the sons of God, God is in the process of revealing us as well. So it says, "For I consider that the sufferings of this present time are not worth comparing with the glory that is to be revealed to us. For the creation waits with eager longing for the revealing of the sons of God." Now, I've mentioned this before, but if we're here to talk about gender, sexuality, masculinity, femininity, and how that relates to our spiritual lives and to God, the crisis that we're in our culture right now is a crisis of identity, right? It's not, we're not sitting here today going, okay, there's a problem because just there's a moral problem. There is a moral problem, but the problem has escalated now to the level of identity, where people are searching to find out what they are. They're searching for identity. You hear the word identify a lot, right? Like, how do you identify? They're wanting to understand, really, this glory. They're not thinking of it in those biblical terms, but they're wanting to understand the glory that they were created to reveal and to carry. That's, as Christians, as Bible students, we have to understand that when we are hearing these crazy, confusing conversations about how do you identify and all the different ways there are to identify and what your identity is and all of this, we need to be able to translate that into biblical ideas of glory. People are searching for their glory. They're searching for the revelation, the truest essence of what they are. What am I? And the reason they're so confused is because they're looking at themselves for that, which is like a circular problem, right? Like, you can't, your identity is going to be defined by a reference point outside of you, right? So, and underneath all of this, when people are desperately searching for what am I, what they're really searching for is love. The hunger behind that intellectual question is a hunger for love. Because what you are will determine who loves you and how much and why and whether they should or not, whether you're worth it. Right? So when you hear these conversations going on, I've started a conversation about this transgender issue that got brought up in this book I'm reading. So I'm talking to a couple of you about that. But, like, that's one example. But when you hear these conversations going on, as a believer, the Bible says we regard no one according to the flesh. We can't just look at them and be like, well, you're wrong. We have to see what's going on beneath the surface, what God sees. And what God sees is the age-old, desperate human cry for, what am I? Which is, in God's eyes, in his ears, he hears, what is my glory? We don't say that, but that is what we're asking when we say, what am I? What is my glory? What is my worth? And God also knows, because he made us for this, that underneath that question is, am I lovable? Am I worthy enough to be loved? And who will love me? Who should love me? Our identity is rooted in love. Remember, all the way back to session 1 and 2. Our identity is rooted in the Trinity. It's rooted in God the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, who is a union of love. And so that's what we are. Our sexuality is intended to be a portrait of that. And so this mess that we're in is a mess that can only be solved when our identity is restored and when we, in that identity, are restored to love. When there can be a reopening of the pathway to the love that we were created for. In and out, love. I think people have a sense in the confusion that, of homosexuality, transgenderism, pornography, the different ways that people are falling apart in our society right now, really. I think there's this deep lurking sense at very, very young ages, even, like I've heard of 9-year-olds that I would say this is probably true of. There's a deep lurking sense like something's wrong with the way that love is going out of me and into me. Something's wrong with the way that I am able to receive and give and carry love. And I think that that's a spiritual problem. It is a spiritual problem, but it's gone on for so long now, and I don't know what God's doing, but maybe God is unleashing something because he has a purpose in this. Like maybe he's bringing something to a climactic point for us. But when that deep-rooted spiritual cry for love starts to manifest itself in sexual ways where people are literally running in all directions to try and find another way to receive and give love. Like any way, what is my way? That is what people are asking when they're asking this question of what are you? How do you identify? It sounds so sophisticated but it's really a question of love. It's like how do you receive love? How will you give love? And when you put it that way, you can see this is such a spiritual issue. Part of our confusion is, and we've talked so much about Satan's contempt for the feminine, right? Femininity is weak. I'm not saying women are this way or men are this way. I'm saying by nature, femininity is about being broken, open, receptive, submitted, under, second, right? All of those are like icky words to our senses, right? Femininity comes with too much emotion. I mean, the feminine hormone, right? Estrogen. Too much emotion. Can't control my emotions. Can't control my words. There's blood. All the time there's blood. It comes with sacrifice. So femininity has this kind of ring of the underdog. And who wants to be that, right? Like all the good underdog stories are stories where the underdog stops being the underdog. Like that's the whole point, right? So who wants to be that? And that goes for us as women, like who are embodying femininity in a sexual way. But it also goes for all of us as human beings who have the full image of God, masculine and feminine, right? He made us in his image, male and female, and we carry that femininity as human beings, right? And so as human beings, we are the bride of Christ, just to give an example. A lot of this is review, right? Well, there's that same kind of, it's not the same kind of contempt that we have from femininity, but there's a shame that comes with masculinity in a fallen world. So even though we've kind of laughed about how like, oh yeah, this is so great and glorious and this is the hard part, the truth is there's a shame that comes with our dominion as well. There's a shame that comes with the masculine, and it's also rooted in the curses of Genesis 3. If you're the one who's put on top or first or in charge, or you're going to have the plan, and you're living in this world of thorns and thistles where the ground is cursed and the people you're in charge of are weak and broken, and there's nothing you can do about it, God isn't giving you the power of that, then what that means is you will never succeed. So there's a shame that comes with masculinity. And again, not just for men, but for all of us carrying that dominion of God in our hearts, that there's this constant sense of failure, a constant sense of toiling to no end, of futility. There's also the shame of the strength even, right? Because remember I've mentioned that God didn't ever do anything to Adam's, his masculine strength. He touched Eve's feminine strength. Her feminine strength is to be a life giver. He touched that, right? He said, it's going to be hard for you. I'm going to weaken that in you. But for Adam, he never said anything about Adam's dominion. He said all the things about what he was to rule over. So here's Adam, and I'm speaking kind of figuratively. Here's the masculine with strength. Like, let's go. I'm ready to go. Let's do this. I have a plan, right? And you all have this. It's not just men. And yet you take one step in and bam, sorry, it's not going to work. We've all faced that. So there's this shame in the failure, but then there's what do you do when it doesn't work out? Well, if you're being transformed into the image of Christ, then you know all about surrender, submission, humility, dependence. But that's what God's doing in your heart. If you don't have that, then what you do as in the masculine is you press forward. You force it. Brute force. You push in, right? And sometimes we do have to do that. Like, when you're raising a child, sometimes it's like, I'm just going to have to do this again. Another spanking or another, whatever. We're going to have to do this again. Like, sometimes you do have to be forceful, but there's shame in that as well. There can be shame in our strength as well. And then you hear like phrases like power corrupts. And then you think about the masculinity of human rulership over time, like Nero and Hitler. And what happens when men take, or women take, positions of power, and how ugly that can be. Or even just in everyday life, when, this is me, again, like stepping out of my zone and kind of speculating, but it's like, as a woman, I'm walking down the street, I go walking every day, and many times I'll pass by a man on the street. And it's like, I kind of think I know what he might be thinking. He's, because I've talked to Jack about this. He's thinking, please don't be scared of me. I'm not going to hurt you. It's okay. He doesn't want to make eye contact with. There's a break in our humanity because there's a shame to his strength. He's carrying a shame as a man, probably certain men more than others or whatever, but you know what I mean? Like, there's a certain shame that comes with being the stronger one. Men can be predators in a way that women could never be. So there's a shame that comes with that. So it's like, yeah, we can talk about dominion. Oh, that sounds great, but we're all in the fallen world together, right? And so what we have to come to this topic soberly and not just like it's just a celebration, because we have work to do here. We have work to understand, what does God mean by giving us this? What is man, God? What are you thinking? Right? And let's do the work in our minds that we've been doing with the feminine too, right? Like, we've been doing the work of, okay, this goes for women, but it also goes for humanity. Well, we got to do that same thing today too, okay? We're talking about all of humanity. We all have dominion over the creation, right? But then there's a certain way in which men, I'm guessing, are probably more embodying this and carrying this weight even than women do. So we have to kind of do that funny mind thing too. Okay, so moving on. That's my big introduction. The revelation of masculinity and femininity, of all that we're talking about in the light of Jesus Christ, reveals the glory of human dominion. So we've been talking about femininity, but everything that we've learned about femininity up till now is going to help us understand what is so righteous and holy and beautiful and glorious to God about masculinity. Okay? So keep that all in mind. We're not shifting gears. This is not like we've been talking about black and now we're talking about white. It's all one thing. Okay? The thing that makes our dominion so glorious, and this is where we're going to be today, is our capacity for God's love. So the thing that makes it glorious that God has given us dominion is that we do have the capacity for his love. So that's why I've said in the past, he starts with the feminine in his redemption of humanity. He starts with the redemption of our fruit-bearing capacity so that when he gives us dominion, we bring that glory to it. Okay? So that's kind of a summary of where we're headed today. Now, you may have heard when God says, be fruitful and have dominion, you may have heard, oh, that's the cultural mandate. And what that means is, I'm quoting, this is not what I think. And what that means is humans are to build bridges and write symphonies and cure diseases and write novels and basically build culture, right? Now, I have no problem saying culture is a necessary and inevitable byproduct of human dominion. Okay, so that's true. And if you're into worldview and reading these books about culture and all that, fine, go ahead and keep doing that. But I don't think that the command, have dominion, is God telling us, go build human culture. Because if you look in Scripture, look up the phrase, the works of their hands sometime. It's never a good thing in the Bible. The works of their hands are almost always evil. So for God to be like, yeah, your purpose is to go and fill the world with your glory, that's not what God is saying in have dominion, okay? Having dominion is not a matter of what we're going to do. It's not a matter of what we do. And so I'm just wondering if maybe that comes as a surprise, because I know when we talk about fruit bearing, it's like, this is what God is doing in me. So you might think logically, well, then dominion would be what I do for God. And maybe that's how the cycle works. It's like God does something in me, and then I do something for God. And then okay? Or even better, maybe God does something in me, and then the things I do are filled with God. Also true, but I don't think that's what dominion is about. Okay, here's what I think dominion is, and I'm getting this straight out of Psalm 8. Because Psalm 8 flat out asks the question, what is man? It's a question of identity. What am I? How do I identify, God? How should I identify? And what Psalm 8 reveals to us when it says, in verse 5, this is the answer to the question, what is man? Yet you have made him a little lower than the heavenly beings and crowned him with glory and honor. You have given him dominion over the works of your hands. You have put all things under his feet. Having dominion is about identity and place. It's about what you are as a person because of where you stand. Did you notice in Psalm 8 how many prepositions there are? Lower. You've put him over the works of your hands. It's like we're under heaven and we're over earth. That's what it means to be human. It means to be in the place between. It's a matter of what we are and where we stand in the revelation of the glory of God. Okay, so that's where we're headed today, and I'm going to show you how this plays out in Scripture. Being human and having dominion has everything to do with where you stand, in the middle. Heaven and earth, you. What is man? That's you. That's the definition of human. That's what makes us different than all the other creatures. It's what makes us different than God. We're less than God. We're more than the creatures because we're in between. Okay? Our glory, our identity, our fullest, truest, most innocent, uncovered humanity is that we hold the place between heaven and earth. We're a little lower than heaven, a little higher than earth. Our place of dominion is qualified because of our spiritual capacity to be filled with God. So it's because God comes into us and over us that we become qualified to have dominion. Isaiah 11 I read it a few times ago. It talks about the shoot that comes forth from the stump of Jesse that's full of wisdom and grace and righteousness. And then this world emerges from him. And at the end of that passage, it says, the earth will be full of the knowledge of the Lord. The outcome of human dominion, the purpose of human dominion is not to build culture. It's to fill the earth with the knowledge of the Lord. And we are that creature with that purpose because we are the only creature capable and with the capacity of knowing the Lord. That's how the earth is going to be full of the knowledge of him. Okay? All right, so there's a picture, just like when we've been talking about femininity this whole time, and trees are our created picture that God has given us in Genesis 1, all around us. Has anyone started looking at trees differently? I know, they're everywhere for one thing. I never noticed them before. They're everywhere. Trees are everywhere. And they're just such a beautiful, constant picture and reminder of my life and of my identity in the femininity of God, right? But we have a picture that God's given us that we can look at almost every night that gives us a picture of our dominion, okay? So remember in Genesis 1, God said, let there be two great lights, the greater light to govern the day and the lesser light to govern the night. That's the sun and the moon. And he uses the word govern about the sun and the moon, right? And so the sun and the moon are the created picture that we can look at and learn something through the lens of God's word about what kind of dominion it is that God's given us. And these lights have different kinds of glory. Okay, so just like God has his glory and we have our glory, but it's like, I feel unworthy of that, Lord. What do you mean by that? What is man that you are mindful of him? What is my glory? What is my identity? God says, well, let's look at the sun and the moon to start, okay? The sun represents God's self-existing power and authority, right? The sun it's not getting its light from anywhere else. It's self-existing light, right? God's dominion, just like the sun, is the source of all life. So it shines out. The sun is, in a sense, very masculine because it's external, it's shining forth, it's penetrating life to the earth, and everything else is receiving that light for life, okay? And that is a reflection of God's dominion. God's dominion gives life. God's dominion is self-existing. Nobody made him king. Nobody made him creator. He just always was. He always existed. Now, the moon has dominion also, and the moon represents our dominion, okay? Because don't you think it's interesting that God said, let's give 2 lights in the sky to show what dominion's all about? Not 1, but 2, right? And that's because he is dominion, and yet he's given us dominion. So he's wanting to show the relationship. He's wanting to show the distinction and the relationship between the 2 kinds of dominion so that we'll understand our relationship to him. So the moon represents our dominion, which, like the moon, is a reflection of the sun's light. Our dominion is to be a reflection of God's dominion. Our moments of glory wax and wane, right? Like our dominion, it comes and it goes. We're going to talk about that a lot today, how God, he gives and he takes away. He raises up and he brings low. Our dominion comes and goes, but God's doesn't. God's is perpetual. It's the source of all dominion. The moon has dominion, but it doesn't hold the ultimate power of life. The moon's glory is that it stands between the dominion of the sun and the fruit-bearing earth. It's a lesser light, but its glory, its dominion, is its position between the two, between the source and the thing that's needing that source, right? And get this, the barren surface of the moon is the perfect reflector of the light of the sun. So you can see the connection there, right? We've said this many times. It's our weakness, it's our dependency, our inability. It's even the curse that renders us powerless against many things. All of that becomes the perfect reflector of God's dominion in our life. So God is never asking us to be the source of anything in your home, in your family, in your life, in your church. He's never asking you ever to be the source of anything. All he's ever asking you to do is reflect his dominion, his glory, his light, right? Another interesting thing about the moon that Genesis 1:16 says is that the moon rules over the night. It says, and God made 2 great lights, the greater light to rule the day and the lesser light to rule the night. The moon's dominion over the night is of little use unless it is receiving the light of the sun. And there are those times, right, where we can't see the moon or where it's just a tiny sliver and the world is very dark, right? So the moon's light that it gives is of little use unless it's receiving the light of the sun. In the same way, human dominion in a fallen world is of no use whatsoever unless we are aligned to receive and reflect the glory of God. The glory of God is the revelation of his dominion, that he pours out his power in love to give life. That's God's glory. God's glory is that he could literally, in one breath, squash everything, and yet that he uses that power to give life. And not just give life like a doctor would give life, but he gives life in love. He gives life through love, through communion, through union, through fellowship, through knowing you. That's God's glory. That's his essence. That's the revelation of the truest essence of who God is. That's his dominion. That's the way he rules. So, when we are given places of dominion, it's simple. Our dominion is supposed to reflect that. God never puts someone in charge where the job isn't to benefit and bless the people with your power. Whether it's you're a child, whether you're a parent of a child or the king of a country or the pastor of a church, God gives you that position of power and dominion for them. Just like the sun is for us on the earth. Okay? So and then let's remember too, I'm bringing in so many pieces from before when we talked about wisdom, that God's way of ruling us is to lay down his life for his sheep, is to give his life away in love, right? And then the woman who bears a child and gives birth to a child is a portrait of that, is a human embodiment of that way of love. And that's folly to the world. That's folly. The way of the cross sounds like a bad idea to the world. But that is God's dominion. So here we are now, we're talking about the very same thing that we talked about at the lowest of the fruit bearing, and now we're talking about it as if it's the highest of dominion. God's way of ruling is the way of the laboring mother. It is the way of the cross. And that's folly. So, we need to be ready for that in our own hearts. When God gives us a position of power or authority, we need to be ready to do the calculus that it's going to take to somehow maintain that position of authority and power and strength in this way. I think the secret to why it might be so incredibly hard is because we don't realize it. We're in this gorgeous room. None of us are dying of hunger. We're so buffered from the curse. But I think that the reason it's so hard is because we are in our core in a constant survival mode. Like this world puts us in constant survival mode. So that's where I think the non-fluidity comes in, is that like when God has us down, those of you that are seasoned in the faith or that have learned this by God's grace, like when you're down, there is something you're receiving, right? It's like, oh, I'm feeling like Jesus in the desert, right? Like I'm starving, but I feel the Spirit filling me. And I want this to end, but at the same time, there's a beauty to this and there's a wonderfulness to this, right? It's funny because it seems to me, it's like the longer I walk with the Lord, the more it's easier to stay in step with the Spirit when he has me down in a low because of something that's happened. It's when I get here that I start to freak out and forget what it is that because, right? That makes sense, because how can I be broken and contrite and humble and all that when everything is going great? So really, this is the harder problem to solve. And as Western American modern people, this is our problem. This is our big problem we have to solve, guys. We are so comfortable and so well fed and so rich. My dad, who had a PhD in history, would tell me there is not a king in the ancient world who was ever half as rich as we are, in terms of like what we're eating, the clothes we're wearing, the comfort that we have, the regulation of temperature. We all drove here in a car, not on the back of a horse. Like the amount of comfort that we are used to, that we see as baseline, puts us in a very, very precarious position when it comes to functioning in our dominion in the way that God functions. So yeah, it's a good point. Like we need to understand, like this is actually the hard part. This is where we're going to fall apart, is when God lets us be on top of things, right? Okay, And we will talk a little bit more about that in the next session. I want to go a little bit into the story of Saul and David. But let me give you I've given you kind of the natural paradigm that we can look to understand our place in the middle, right? And the sun and the moon, does that help a little bit? That kind of gives you a nice, quick, familiar picture of what your dominion is, right? And you can milk that for all it's worth. I mean, it's such a simple picture, you can't hardly like take it too far, right? Like just if you ponder that and think about that reality, I think it can really teach your soul what God wants from you when he puts you here. But the biblical, like redemptive story paradigm that God gives us of what it means to have dominion is the priesthood. Okay? Did you think I was going to say the kingdom, the kingship, the king? No. Originally, kings don't come into Israel's story until 1 Samuel, like halfway through the Old Testament. But when God began with Israel, his original position that he gave to his son is the position of a priest. And that makes a lot of sense because a priest is someone who stands in the middle, and facilitates relationship between God and man. That's the whole definition of a priest, right? So to be a worthy priest, two things have to be true of you. One is you have to know and love God. And I want to refine that, and we will refine that as we go. But I would like to refine that to say you have to know and be loved by God. Because as the priest, your love is coming this way, in. You're standing in God's presence, but you're you're ministering to God by keeping the bread right and the lamps right and the everything, but you're the one standing in the glory of God. You're the honored one. You're the one that comes out with your face shining, right? So you have the priest receives love from God and knowledge of God, and then you also have to know and love the people. You have to have a relationship with the people, okay? And so when God says, have dominion, originally what's in his mind is not be the king, get out there and take charge. Originally what he has in his mind is, you're the priest. Have dominion. Do what a priest does, okay? Tend to the relationship between God and his whole creation, including the people. That's the kind of dominion that the moon has. It's the kind of dominion that a housewife has. It's a feminine dominion. It's a dominion of caring for home, of caring for a relationship, of facilitating that. And all of us, men and women, have that place. That is the dominion that God's given us. And when kings do come into the story, the good kings that are referenced as like pleasing to God, this is what they all had in common. They all used their power and position to facilitate proper relationship between God and his people. Without exception, this is God's measure of a good leader or ruler. You read through 1st and 2nd Kings, and you will see every single time it says, now so-and-so did not please the Lord, or so-and-so did please the Lord. This king was an excellent king or a good king. You're going to find out why. And it always has to do with how he treated the temple, how he treated the sacrifices, how he treated the people that he was tending to. Always. How he obeyed the laws of God. So the worthiness of a king comes down to how he's facilitating and using his power to facilitate the relationship between God and his people. And a lot of times that there's kind of a partnership between the king and the priest. And if the king and the priest are both abusing their power, then they're no good. If the king is giving the priesthood the proper authority and dignity and freedom that it was supposed to have by the law, then it's a good king, right? So you can be the king. God's like, okay, fine, whatever. If you want to call it a king, call it a king. But what I'm still looking at is the priesthood. I'm still looking at how you as the king are using that power to facilitate the relationship that I've established with my people. And so it's the spiritual leadership of the leader that matters to God. When God says have dominion, he's concerned with not are you going to build culture, but are you going to build spiritual relationship? Are you going to fill the earth with the knowledge of the Lord? How is your spiritual leadership? To be human is to be a spiritual leader. That is our function. And I don't mean that you have to have like a ministry position or that you have to be paid for it or that even anyone has to recognize it. You don't need a title, a position of authority. But if you're human, as you mature, you will find yourself more and more in the place between. The place between God and someone else. Might be a wife, might be children, might be a church group, might be your neighborhood, might be the people you work with. But in any case, you're in that position of spiritual leadership, and that's what it means to be a spiritual leader. Again, it's not the same as a king. It's not to say, oh, now I'm a spiritual leader, so I got to have a plan. I got to get things done. I got to exercise my authority. Those things all might be true at one time or another, but the job description is stand between, which the part that we're always going to fail at is once we're here, we forget about here. And so here we are standing between, and here's God, and here's our people, and we go like this. I've got a job to do. And then we fixate on the job we have to do. I want to do a good job, and we tell ourselves, I want to do a good job to please God. I don't want to let God down. Da-da-da-da-da. And God's over here saying, I'm right here. I'm the source of all of this. So as the spiritual leader, you need to be faced this way. Receiving, right? And sometimes, the picture of a shepherd is, they'll just follow you. Sometimes you don't even have to turn around, depending on the position we're talking about. You don't even have to turn around and tell anyone to do anything. If you're a 10th grader in a high school, you can be that kind of spiritual leader. Just all in this direction, people will follow you, right? Sometimes you do have to turn and give instructions, give correction, give discipline, give vision. But you never take your eyes off of this, right? That's priesthood. Just really quickly, let me pop through some points to give. I just want you to, you can go back into the Bible and look for this yourself, but I just want to give you a little bit of the story so you can see how important this was to God. So again, referencing the Bible, if you have, I just like to look at it in the Bible here. So here's 1 Samuel when they first asked for a king, right? But here is Exodus where God says, I'm going to give you priests. So for this much of the story, there were no kings. No kings in Israel. Only one king, God, right? So I just want to take you through some of this to show you how it worked and how important it was to God that he remained the king and that this is how he's going to remain their source of life and love. In Exodus 4, God calls Israel his firstborn son. You remember last week when I said sonship is a title of kingship, right? So sonship is a title of dominion. I wrote that right here last week, right? Sonship is a title of our dominion. But the first sons of God were Israel, and then when God says to them to define them as a nation, what he wants their purpose to be, so if they were to say, just like we were saying, what is man? If they were to say, what is Israel? What's our identity, God? The first thing he declares over them is, you shall be to me a kingdom of priests. That's your identity. A kingdom of priests. Which means, and this is fulfilled all the way in the New Testament, it means everyone in your kingdom knows God. Which all through the Old Testament, we don't see that to be true. But again, in the New Testament, when we have Jesus the King giving us the Spirit, then everyone in the kingdom of Christ knows God. All of you are a royal priesthood, like I read in Peter this morning, right? So we're a king. He wants his people to be a kingdom of priests. What it means to be God's son, what it means to be God's nation, is to be a kingdom where every person in the kingdom has a relationship with God. Then a little bit later, after they're out of Egypt, like right away after they leave Egypt, he tells them, well, let me back up a minute. As sort of like the little sign of like, you are my firstborn son as a nation, God claims all the firstborn sons. And when they go through the Passover in Egypt, and they have that plague of the firstborn where the firstborn of Egypt die, and God saves all the firstborn of Israel, that's God saying, that's just kind of like his picture of like, you're my firstborn son, you belong to me, you're mine. And he tells them, like, you owe me every firstborn of your family, every firstborn of your livestock, any male that opens the womb, in other words, the first male to be born from any female, is mine. But then he redeems the firstborn of Israel by claiming the whole tribe of Levi for himself and saying, you can have your firstborn. I'm going to call this tribe of Levi, who's going to be my priests, my firstborn. So what he's doing is, in a dot-to-dot way, is he's saying the priests are my firstborn. The priests are my heirs. The priests will get the best inheritance, which becomes ironic later because when they get into the land, the whole inheritance land gets divvied out to all the tribes except Levi. Levi doesn't get an inheritance land. They don't get a portion of the inheritance. What they get is God. He says, God, I will be their inheritance. Right? So, I mean, this is all so pointing towards the gospel, right? But he's building Israel into this nation with this strong firstborn awareness and mentality, right? So to be God's son, to be God's firstborn son, the heir of everything, is to be the heir of God himself. And it's to be a priest, which makes sense, right? Like, if you're the priest, what better inheritance than God himself? Because your job is to know God, right? If you're the king, then a good inheritance would be like this whole land, because your job is to take care of the nation. But that's not God's idea of a firstborn. He wants this relationship. That's what he's all about doing, right? That's the whole story of redemption, is about reestablishing the connection between humanity and God. And so in that, he brings in his firstborn son, puts him right in the middle, and calls it the priesthood. Okay? If you read the law, if you read the words of Moses, Genesis is the story, but then in Exodus we start getting what came off Sinai. Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. I kind of added it up like it's a loose estimation, but probably 60% of it has to do with how they're supposed to worship God. It's not all laws about like, do this, do that, don't do this, don't commit this sin. There is that in the law, but more than half of it, more than half of what's coming out of God's mouth, of what he wants from the people, is directed at the priests. This is how you should sacrifice the animals. These are the animals you should sacrifice. This is the animals you shouldn't sacrifice. This is what you should wear. This is how you should build a tabernacle. This is how you should come in and out of it. This is who gets to come in and out of it. These are the lamps. This is the stuff I want you to put on the walls. I mean, it's like God is so concerned with that relationship. That is so important to him. Of all the things he could be telling this brand new nation that's going to go out and have to represent him, he's fixated on the people who are going to stand between him and the rest of the nation. That's very unique of God. That tells us something about how important our relationship with him is. Also, the priests in battle formation, when they were to go out forward in battle, God said the priests are going to go first. Oh, that sounds funny. I would think maybe the strongest warriors would go out first on their horses. Or no, the priests will go out ahead, carrying the Ark of the Covenant. The Ark of the Covenant carries the presence of God. So that makes sense. He's the king, right? But the priests are the ones who maintain that relationship with the king, so the priests are going to go ahead forward. So it's the priests that carry the weight of the battle. The promised land, if you read Joshua, the promised land was taken entirely by the priesthood. The priests are the ones marching around the walls of Jericho, blowing the trumpets. They're not armed. They don't have power. They don't have really even authority. They're authorized, but they're not going around telling people what to do. The dominion that God gave to his firstborn son is a dominion of the right to stand between God and the people and facilitate that connection of life. That's what God means when he says, have dominion. So our work becomes, man, I've got to have a relationship with God. God puts you in charge of anything, even if it's just your own life. Even if it's just, where should I go to college? What should I do with my career? That's you being in charge of something. And if he puts you in charge of anything, the first and most important task is to have a relationship with God. So do you see the gap closing? This is where we receive from God. This is where he calls us into dominion. But no sooner do we get here than we need to go back down here again, right? And so I'm going to go, where'd my marker go? I'm going to go more into this in the next session. But the day after the last session, Monica and I were talking, and she was saying, yeah, it seems like those moments of dominion are so fleeting, right? It's like, you get on top and no sooner do you feel like you have your act together, things are going the way you want them to, and then you're like, okay, God's calling me back down again. And I laughed and I said, yeah, the circle should actually kind of look more like this. Like proportionately, right? If this is our place of dominion and fruit bearing, proportionately, this is kind of a narrower point, right? But I think that's kind of is the point. And we'll go into this more, but that is kind of the point, is that God does want us here. And our dominion, our place of dominion that connects us to him, isn't about everything going right. Because that's not what he's asking us to do. He's asking us to be loved. He's asking us to position ourselves to be loved by him, to receive from him, right? One more thing about the priests and the law. In Deuteronomy, God gives instructions to the future kings. He's like, when you go into the land and you appoint these kings, here's what I want from them. And it has all to do about not acquiring too much wealth and not getting like big heads and lording it over their brothers. Like, it's very different from the way that the world rules. But the other thing he wants of the kings is that they're supposed to, I just picture like a first grader. They're supposed to copy the law, like copy it. The king sits down and does copy work for I don't know how many days that would have taken. Copy Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. And then, once you've done that and humbled yourself to do that as the king, to submit it to the priests for approval. Like, did I do a good job? So there's the king. In God's law, he's like, the king comes under the priest. The king submits to my word and then submits his understanding of my word to the priest. And only then can he rule in the way that I want him to. So even the king is being asked to submit and come under and receive from God and be filled by God and spend the time knowing God, and then mark that with the submission of the priesthood. That's pretty incredible. The reference there is Deuteronomy 17. So once again, God's kind of like, well, you can have a king. You're going to ask for a king sooner or later. But the measure of that king is only as good as what I've already established, right? So then we get to 1 Samuel. By the time of 1 Samuel, in chapter 2, it says that the priests were worthless. It says that the sons of Eli were worthless men. Why? Because they did not know the Lord. There's the definition of a worthless priest. It's like a car was a worthless car. Why? Because it would not drive. The book was a worthless book. Why? Because it didn't have words in it. The cup was a worthless cup. Why? Because it didn't have a bottom. Like, these are things that are not doing the thing they were made to do. And so when a priest is made to know God, then when it doesn't know God, when he doesn't know God, he's worthless. Right? It's not, yeah. So that's what 1 Samuel opens with. The story problem in 1 Samuel is that Israel's lost its connection to God. But they are going to ask for a king. They're going to be in all this trouble because they've lost their connection to God, and their solution in their minds is, let's get us a king. Okay, so that's coming in a minute. But you may not know this. Like, you may know that you may already know that God promised to David that he would send a king, an eternal king with an eternal throne, right? We're pretty familiar that Jesus is the son of David and that Jesus is the King of Kings and he's the anointed king, he's the Christ, right? But before God promised anything to David, before David was even part of the story, God promised Israel a faithful priest. And he said that this faithful priest would restore the connection between humanity and himself. So on God's heart is, I want to give you guys a good priest. God's not thinking, I want to give you a good king. Okay? And then David becomes that king because his heart and his desire and priority was to facilitate connection between God and Israel. And that was the main thing on David's heart was, I put Psalm 132, just a little quote from there. He says, I will not enter my house or get into my bed. I will not give sleep to my eyes or slumber to my eyelids until I find a place for the Lord. Like, key on David's heart as king was to facilitate this relationship between God and the people. And that's what made him a good king. He had a priestly heart. And then later, when the kingdom falls completely to shambles, the prophets start talking about this priestly king. Zechariah says, there shall be a priest on God's throne. In the kingdom of priests, even the king is a priest, because God really is the true and ultimate original king. So that's our redemptive paradigm for dominion. When we think of being on top or having dominion or being in charge, we need serious retraining of our minds to this. Because we're always, just like Israel, we are always going to think of a king. We're always going to ask for a king. We're always going to ask to be a king. We're always going to wish that we could do that for God and really just pull it all together. And God's saying, that is never what I was asking for when I put you in the middle. I didn't put you on the top. I put you in the middle. That is what I want from you. Stay in the middle, which Jesus says like this, abide in me. So Jesus, this whole Old Testament story that I've been telling you, Jesus embodies that human sonship and dominion as a priest king. If you read the book of Hebrews, you'll get the presentation of Jesus as a priest. And Hebrews is not negating that he's a king. In fact, Hebrews goes so deep into the kind of king that Jesus is that most of us can't even understand it, talking about Melchizedek and the order of Aaron and all of these. But Jesus was a king because he was a priest. God put Jesus on the throne of heaven because Jesus offered the sacrifice. Exactly. And this is interesting. In Samuel, in the book of Samuel that we were just talking about, where the problem is they need a priest, a godly priest, and yet they're demanding a king like all the other nations, and so the whole problem goes from there. Samuel, not David, is the person that Luke compares Jesus to. And so there's so much to this that I haven't gone into, and so that's why I'm kind of stumbling with my words. It's like I haven't told you all the different details, but in the book of Samuel, you know that you have Saul and David, right? We're going to talk about them later, Saul and David. But first you have Samuel. And last week we talked about Hannah. Hannah's my favorite barren woman story because you go all into the depths of her heart and everything with this. But she doesn't give birth to David. She gives birth to Samuel. And so in the book of 1 Samuel, what really goes wrong is that Samuel, like the whole first 7 chapters, are setting Samuel up to be the leader of Israel. He's the great priest that knows God finally, right? He's the answer to their problems. He's also a judge who is kind and loving and goes on this like extensive circuit to make sure that everybody's cared for, which normally the judges would just sit back and let the people come to them. He's also a prophet whose story of becoming a prophet is well told in the book of 1 Samuel. We know that he hears from God. It says he was established as a prophet of the Lord. So Samuel is prophet, priest, and judge, which was what they had before they had a king. Samuel's the paradigm for spiritual leadership. And so what follows with Saul and David is a question of what's going to make these men like Samuel. Samuel's the model. Samuel's the paradigm. And Luke tips his hat to this. This is so crazy. Okay, right? We've talked about how we have this one story in the Bible of Jesus' childhood, right? This one story, and it's in Luke. And here's what Luke says about Jesus. He tells us that he grew in the presence of the Lord. That is a direct quote from Samuel about Samuel. So I just put it down here. As young boys, this is what Samuel says about what the book of Samuel says about Samuel. It says, and the boy was ministering to the Lord in the presence of Eli the priest, and the boy Samuel grew in the presence of the Lord. In Luke 2:40, Luke tells us, and the child Jesus grew and became strong, filled with wisdom, and the favor of God was upon him. So they both appear in the temple, and then if you turn the page, as young men in 1 Samuel 2:26, it says, now the boy Samuel continued to grow both in stature and in favor with the Lord and also with man. And Luke 2:52 says, and Jesus increased in wisdom and in stature and in favor with God and man. So what does that mean? Why is Luke going to these pains to compare Jesus to Samuel? Well, Luke is also telling us in the midst of that chapter, this whole story of Zechariah the priest and Elizabeth, right? And how Jesus comes into the temple. And I think what Luke is saying is Jesus was this faithful promised priest. Jesus is like Samuel. He may not be from the tribe of Levi, and he may not have served and functioned like a priest, but Jesus is the leader according to the pattern of Samuel. He's the priestly king. And so Luke takes pains to point us back to Samuel because Samuel was trained as a priest, and Jesus is trained as a priest. Jesus is the true light which gives light to everyone. So that's like the sun, right? But his glory was not to build or even fix human culture. He fulfills the purpose of humanity by coming into perfect alignment with the dominion of God's love for mankind. For 30 years, he fulfilled the human purpose, which is to be loved. And then that's how God announces him. This is my beloved son. And what qualifies him to be the perfect human radiance of God's glory to the world. So when Jesus comes out in his baptism and God says, this is my beloved son, we have to think to ourselves, that's 30 years since Luke's quote, like since Jesus went into the temple, since Jesus started in the temple, he learned who God was, and we can assume that's what he kept doing for 30 years. Like this little tiny quote about Jesus grew or increased in wisdom and in stature and favor with God and man, I think is supposed to carry us through 30 years. That's what he was doing for 30 years. He was building his knowledge of God, building his relationship with God, building, most importantly, his connection to God, his ability to go in and out before the Lord. And he was growing in favor with the people around him. He was learning how to relate to them. He was caring about them for 30 years. And that's why God says, "This is my beloved son." And remember, to God, to call him son is to call him a priest, is to say, "This is my firstborn son. I am his inheritance. He will fight my battles." Or I will fight his battles, right? He will fight his battles in my power and strength. So Jesus is a priest long before he's a king. He's not a religious priest. We don't see him operating at the tabernacle, at the temple, right? But he, in his heart, he is stepping into that faithful priestly promise of God that came long before God promised a king. And that's how he is our example of dominion. So Hebrews 1:3 says, "He is the radiance of the glory of God and the exact imprint of his nature. And he upholds the universe by the word of his power. After making purification for sins, he sat down at the right hand of the Majesty on high. For to which of the angels did God ever say, 'You are my son'?" Let me read part of Hebrews, the next part in chapter 2 as well. I didn't know if I'd have time to read this, but Hebrews 2:5 says, so this is still in the train of thought of what I just read, Jesus sitting down as priest on the throne of heaven. "For it was not to angels that God subjected the world to come." Remember how Psalm 8 said, "You made him a little lower than the angels." What is man? You made him a little lower than the angels. So as a human being, Jesus stepped down lower than the angels. And yet Hebrews tells us God didn't give the inheritance to the angels, right? It was not to angels that God subjected the world to come, of which we are speaking. It has been testified somewhere, "What is man that you are mindful of him, or the son of man that you care for him? You made him for a little while lower than the angels. You have crowned him with glory and honor, putting everything into subjection under his feet. Now in putting everything in subjection to him, he left nothing outside his control. At present, we do not yet see everything in subjection to him." Here's where that frustration comes in. Jesus stepped into it. Jesus stepped into the frustration of the curse on Adam. "But we see him who for a little while was made lower than the angels, namely Jesus, crowned with glory and honor because of the suffering of death, so that by the grace of God he might taste death for everyone." He's crowned because of the suffering of death. That's that folly of God again. God rules, and his dominion is one of laying down his life and setting aside his power and not grasping it. So Jesus' dominion is given to him because he suffered. It's such a paradox. It's like I can't explain it. There's just a million ways to say it, but you can't ever explain it. "For it was fitting that he, for whom and by whom all things exist, in bringing many sons to glory," remember that's where we started, the revealing of the sons of God, "should make the founder of their salvation perfect through suffering. For he who sanctifies and those who are sanctified all have one source." Let me say that again. He who sanctifies, the priest, and those who are sanctified, the people, all have one source, God. So Jesus' dominion is one that steps between. His sonship, his dominion, originates in his connection between, not his position on top. His glory is that he perfectly radiates the dominion of God, which is love. This glory was developed in Jesus through cycles of sonship that we talked about last week, in which he surrendered continually to God, expanding his soul in the love of God. So as I was thinking about this way of thinking about the circle, I thought, when I had it like this, it looks like a cycle, right? Around and around we go. And it feels that way. It just feels like we're not getting anywhere, right? Like, man, how could I be so low right now? And 3 days ago, everything was working just fine. What am I doing wrong? And this is what God showed me about that. So the cycle looks more like this. Actually, I like it to be fatter on the bottom. The moment of glory is a point in time, right? And this is where we live. This is where the water flows down to. But the next time around, God digs deeper. And then the next time around, he digs even deeper. And I've thought so much about this because the glory of this is being revealed to my eyes right now. It's probably why I'm having trouble even putting it into words. The glory of this is obvious, right? It's like everything's beautiful, everything's working. But it's just a moment in time when things are going right. And the real work of this life is that God would come into us and open us up and fill us up. And what he's doing every time he takes you back around is he's expanding your soul. He's expanding your heart and your life. He's expanding your maturity, your strength. He's expanding your capacity. Every time he brings you back down, he's like, let's make this even bigger. Let's make you even bigger, even fuller, with more capacity to love. So, right, God's power, his love pours down. Should have left more room for that. And then in he goes, and this is where we live. And does it hurt? Yeah. Does expansion hurt? Yeah. Like if you're pregnant, it's like the growing hurts, right? You get stretch marks. But that's capacity you have now, right? And so then he takes you around and he takes you back to another moment of glory. And guess what happens? Out it comes. Glory always pours down. It always pours down. And so all of this that you were busy suffering through becomes the capacity and the fullness that's going to pour out of you. Which makes the work down below so glorious. So full of glory. And this is what Jesus did. He had so many stages in his life of letting go of the, Paul talks about he didn't grasp at the glory that was his, right? Of letting go and going down and letting God, like in becoming a human. Just imagine, right? Like imagine God himself, eternal, infinite God, heading down into the one thing God didn't know. What it's like to be a human. And imagine how could it be that God himself did the one thing that would expand his capacity to love us, to love and to give. He did the one thing he'd never done before, which is to become human. And that experience, even just in the incarnation, even just in becoming a baby and having to have his diaper changed, having to be carried everywhere, and having to be fed, and at the mercy of two people. That's the one thing God never did before. It's the one thing God didn't know before. He didn't know that before. And so in doing that, and coming down, he expands his capacity for us. How could that be? How could it be? You know, and then he grows up and it says he learned obedience. God learned obedience, the one thing God never had to do before. And he lets go and he goes down and he learns obedience. He has to open the book and read the pages just like you and I do. Oh, what does that mean? Oh, who was that? Oh, I forgot. Can you He had to learn obedience. He had to learn to obey his dad, even when his dad maybe called it wrong. Really, Dad? That's what we have to do next? Yes, son. Okay. God did that. And in doing that, he expands his capacity to sympathize with our weakness. He expands his capacity to be a good priest for us. He knows how it feels when we have to do things that are hard. He knows how it feels to have to learn. He knows how it feels to make mistakes and get it wrong. And then what about his ministry? He lets go of that beautiful little world that I'm sure he had with Mary and Joseph and God his Father, and he leaves that and he goes out and he calls these 12 renegade people and he walks with them through the dirt and he eats with Mary and Martha because he doesn't have a home of his own, and he lets go of all the comforts of home to expand his capacity to understand what it feels like to be an orphan. What it feels like to be homeless. What it feels like to be hunted, to be hated, rejected, misunderstood, misjudged. God did that. And in doing so, he expanded his capacity for the world. And then he lets go even of those 12, and he heads up to the cross. And God, who had always been, who existed from eternity past, we can't even wrap our heads around it. God, who is life, who makes the energy and the life of the sun look like a fading star. God, who is the source of all life, takes on the cross and suffers and is mocked and ridiculed and rejected and breathes his last and expands his capacity to understand the power of death. The one thing God didn't know, was death. And he let go so he could know more, so he could take in more. And in doing so, he becomes our source of everything. There's not one thing that we have lived that he has not lived. He knows everything. Don't say to God, well, Jesus never sinned, so how could he sympathize with what I'm going through right now? Jesus never failed. How could he sympathize? No. Jesus faced it. The difference between us and Jesus isn't that we've sinned and he hasn't. It's that he faced it and he took it all in. And he held on to God the whole way through. We would derail. We would say, you know what, enough of this process. I want strength. I want to feel like things are going my way. And Jesus took all that temptation and all that hardship, and he sat in it with God. And he expanded his capacity for you, so that he can carry you, like it says in Isaiah, in his bosom, like so that he can carry you. Because he's big enough He knows enough. He's done enough. He's done it all. Our dominion follows that path. If there are people that you are placed in charge of, that you have dominion over, if God gives you responsibility and authority, if it's to follow this path, it's to go into hard things with God, for them. It's not about doing everything right. It's not about having all the answers. It's not about having all the plan. It's not about knowing all the future. It's about knowing God and being loved by him and remaining there. If you remain there, he will expand your capacity. And when he pours you out, you will have all that to give. You will have all his love that he's given you to give to others. And that's what dominion is. So 1 John 4, I'm going to close with this. We have a few minutes if you have anything to say, but let me just read this verse out of 1 John 4. In this, the love of God was made manifest among us, that God sent his only Son into the world so that we might live through him. In this is love, not that we have loved God, but that he loved us. We love because he first loved us. And since his dominion is love, we could say we have dominion because he first had dominion in us. But we're talking about love. If anyone has any questions or thoughts they want to share, we have a few minutes. Oh, one sec. Gloria?
I think the struggle of worthiness is what has impacted my relationship with God and being a wife and a mother, and then just knowing that place and purpose, understanding that part of dominion, but then really wondering, is this what you're asking me to do? And then that constant feeling of, am I worthy? And then that, like when you said, like things are going well, and it's almost like this, like frightening, scary. I don't know how to explain it. I don't know. Like then I'm not humble.
Yeah.
And because then there's that proud, rather than it being the glory of God and giving him that glory, it's like this, and I don't know if that's the enemy or my own flesh, because I don't want to just blame it on the enemy. So I know that is something that I'm constantly like just trying to work through and seek his wisdom, the wisdom in that, like where is that? What is the wisdom that is coming, so that I don't have that unworthiness,
right?
Knowing that what the dominion is.
Yeah.
Is perfect.
Well, in the next session, we're going to talk a little bit about the difference between Saul and David. And I think we're a lot like Saul. Like naturally, I think Saul is a picture of what we naturally do. And I think when we get to this point, like look at it. It's a precarious position to be on this tip, right? And it feels that way when things are going well. All of a sudden you're like, oh dang, what am I going to do to mess this up? Right? There's a feeling of precariousness, like, oh no, I'm going to let everybody down. Or I mean, I've seen this over and over. I've felt it, and I've watched people go through this when they're on top. And there's that feeling of precariousness, and it's the question, am I worthy of this? Am I worthy? And how am I going to hold this together? And all of a sudden we get right here and we feel exposed, like we're standing on the tip of something, right? And I think the wisdom is that God says, I know how you feel. Let me show you again that you're worthy. And he takes us here, because this is where we're worthy. To be a fruit bearer is our worthiness, is our glory. And so when God takes us down, you can think of it as discipline if you're going to think of discipline like learning and teaching. But it's better than discipline. It's it's a covering. It's a way, let's go back down there again, son, daughter. Let me take you back down where the two of us live. And let me love you again. Let me remind you again how much I love you. This is why I started with 1 Peter 2, because, right, he's telling this wife in the pattern of Jesus, if you don't have the power to change your husband's mind, then offer God the hidden beauty of a gentle and quiet spirit, which is in God's eyes very precious. And that's not just for women. That's for all of us when we feel like, I can't hold this together. God says, come down and be loved by me. This is where God loves you. Not that he doesn't love you here, but this is where you're going to feel it. This is where you will feel and experience the love of God. This is a place that we come to, but man, we can't live there. And so God is always pulling us back into his love. So this, I'm starting to see this as like love. Yeah.
That reminds me of like the parable of the virgins and the oil in their lamps.
Mm-hmm.
Like it's the oil of intimacy.
Mm-hmm.
Like that fill, like because when you were saying it fills us up, so
Yeah.
it can be poured out.
Yes.
It's like
Yes.
filling the oil in our
Right.
lamps, so like we can
Mm-hmm.
burn right.
Exactly. And if you think of dominion as the pouring out, that's why I kept doing this, right? If you think of it that way, like how long does it take to pour out what's been filled up, right? Usually it takes longer to fill up than it does to pour out, right? And that, I mean, I think that's the proportion that we live with is like you spend 18 years in high school and then you graduate. Yay, one big fat day and then you're done. It's like, what? You know, or this long engagement and then the wedding day. Yay! It's like that's it. We pour out, we empty out so much faster than we fill up. But remember that in the filling up is where God is happy. Happy God. Because he loves to be with you there so much. It's precious in his sight. Esther, you had a comment a while ago.
Yeah, well, first my comment is kind of, I mean, it's related obviously, but it's not about that, but I do want to say something about that first, which is like, I feel like when, at least for me, like when I feel that I'm on that like little point and it feels precarious, I feel like my tendency is to like, at least before I really knew what that was, like my tendency would be like, I didn't realize that it was supposed to go away, I guess. Like that you're supposed to go back down.
Yeah,
so my
I'm gonna hang on to it.
That I would always feel is like, if I go back down again, that means I failed. That means it's my fault.
Yes.
And so like I've developed this habit, which is to hold on to that,
Uh-huh.
whatever accomplishment or like whatever is causing me
Yep.
to feel that dominion, whether it's like a skill I've got that I'm really good at now, or like a
Right.
position, like a job, or like different things. I'll just grasp onto that and be like, it is my responsibility to like hold on to this as tightly as I can.
Yep.
And so much so that even when God is taking me down, it takes me like all the way almost till I'm at the top again.
Yes.
To realize like I'm still holding on to that old thing when God is trying to like
Right.
do like a new thing and take me to a new level.
Yes.
And I'm like still holding on to it like, I messed up, I'm
Right.
sorry God, like I don't know if you want me to let this go because I thought you gave it to me and now like I messed up and I can't let
Right.
it go. And this is,
Right.
so stressful, but
Right.
actually like what I feel like God's been showing me is like just as soon as you feel yourself falling, just let go.
Yeah.
Because if the more it reminds me of that story of that guy who like fell off the cliff and then like his arm got caught in the rock and he was just like hanging there forever. Like it would have been better for him if he would have just
Yeah.
fallen all the way. But like when you're just like caught there and it's just like this position of suspense.
You can't let it go. Yeah.
Do I let go? Do I hold on?
Right.
So I feel like that's like
Yeah.
when you expect to go down again.
Yeah.
You see the freedom to just be like,
Right. Well, and I think going down is scary because we feel like we're losing something that we had. It will feel that way, okay? So when you're headed down, it's going to feel like God's taking something away from me. But if you remember, no, this is where he fills you up. Right here is where you get filled up. Then what you start to learn is going down is scary because it feels like losing, but actually God is inviting you to gain more And all dominion belongs to God. He's not taking anything away from you. He just wants to give you more and more and more. And when you come back around again, whatever it was you felt like you let go of, he's going to double that. And you're going to, and sometimes it takes a different form. So you have to let go of that too. But you're going to come back around and you're going to be like, whoa, what was I even worried about? God has doubled and tripled and quadrupled what he gave me. And I have all of this capacity now to embody that. Like I didn't have the capacity before to pour out the love that was going to be needed in that place, right? Whether it would be marriage or children or a certain job that you want or a ministry that you want. Like we need the capacity for these things. And you meet the man of your dreams and it feels like God took him away, but it's like, no, God's going to give me more capacity for that, right? And he'll bring you back around to what he wants you to do and what he wants you to live.
I think like the shame though is the feeling that, I guess for me it's like the wondering every single time that happens is this God bringing me down, or like is this me letting God down? Like is this me, like he gave me this good thing and I failed? That's to me like the constant battle is like some days I'll be like, oh no, it's really okay because God is in control and he's like bringing me through this. But then other days I'm like, no, this God wanted me to stay in that position and then I failed. And I think that that's where like especially our culture too puts this expectation on people like to like succeed and like get to like a position of like your dream career, your dream relationship, your dream everything, and then just like stay there for the rest of your life.
Yep.
And if something goes wrong, then it's your fault. And
Yes. Yeah.
Basically, yeah.
Yep.
Can I say my other thing that wasn't?
Oh, okay.
That was just inspired by the conversation.
Okay.
I had another thought when you were talking about the when you were talking about how like the priesthood was worthless in Samuel's time, and then because of that, Israel like thought the solution kind of was to ask for a king. It was just making me think. I feel like so often, because me and April were having this conversation on the way here about like how there's like this search for like finding like your ideal life or like the ideal solution to like your problems or like your struggles. And it was making me think like I feel like sometimes we try to keep doing that just by like looking for new sources of power or like new sources of like we need a new king, we need a new job, like we need a new, I don't know, like we just keep looking, we need a new major, like different things like that. But the real problem in the story was that there wasn't that connection to God. And so just getting another priest, and things didn't get better until it came to David, because he was actually the one who reconnected them to God.
Right.
But like just getting a new king like Saul, that didn't help, and
Right.
these priests didn't help. And so I think that has to do with Jesus, because we have to go, he's our connection to God.
Yeah.
And so like it was just making me think like every time, it's so easy to just get distracted and think that the problem is something needs to change.
Circumstances.
Like circumstances need to change, but it's actually like we just need to get reconnected again.
Yeah.
And not just look for a new source, but
Exactly.
go back to the real source.
Yep. Yep. Exactly. Anyone else? We can break for. We're going to talk in the next session. We're going to talk a lot about all of this, so we'll keep going with this idea.